Isis Unveiled by H.P. Blavatsky, published in 1877. This is from Section 2, Religion, and we're continuing on with Chapter 3. If you haven't seen the previous video, there's links in the description box below, as well as one in the right-hand top corner. Part 2 of this playlist, Magic of the Nazarenes. Magic and the ancient mystery schools. History finds that the first Christian sects to have been either Nazarenes, like John the Baptist, or Ebionites, among whom were the relatives of Jesus, or Essenes, Isis, the Therapeutae, the healers, of which Nazara were a branch. All these sects, which only in the days of Irenaeus began to be considered heretical, were more or less Kabbalistic. They believed in the expulsion of demons by magical incantations and practiced this method. Jervis terms the Nabateans and other such sects as, quote, wandering Jewish exorcists, end quote. The Arabic word nabaya, meaning to wander, and the Hebrew naba, or nabe, to prophesy. The Talmud indiscriminately calls all Christians Nazari or Nazarai. All the Gnostic sects equally believed in magic. Irenaeus, in describing the followers of Basilides, says, quote, they use images, invocations, incantations, and all other things pertaining unto magic, end quote. Dunlap, on the authority of Lightfoot, shows that Jesus was called Nazarios, in reference to his humble and mean external condition, quote, for Nazarios means separation or alienation from other men, end quote. The real meaning of the word Nazar signifies to vow or consecrate oneself to the service of God. As a noun, it is a diadem or emblem, reader's note, an image, and reader's note, of such consecration, a head so consecrated. Joseph was styled a Nazar, quote, the head of Joseph, the vertex of the Nazar among his brethren. Samson and Samuel, Semezan and Semvael, are described alike as Nazars. Porphyry, treating of Pythagoras, says that he was purified and initiated at Babylon by Zar Adas, the head of the sacred college. May it not be surmised, therefore, that the Zoroaster was the Nazar of Ishtar, Zar Adas, or Nazar-ad, being the same, with change of that idiom. Ezra was a priest and scribe, a hierophant, and the first Hebrew colonizer of Judea was Zerubbabel, or Zorro, or Nazar of Babylon. The Jewish scriptures indicate two distinct worships and religions among the Israelites, that of Bacchus, or Dionysus worship, under the mask of Yahweh or Jehovah, and that of the Chaldean initiates, to whom belonged some of the Nazars, the Theurgists, as well as a few of the prophets. The headquarters of these were always at Babylon and Chaldea, where two rival schools of the Magians can be distinctly shown, and those who would doubt the statement will have in such a case to account for the discrepancy between history and Plato, who of all men of his day certainly was one of the best informed. Speaking of the Magians, he shows them as instructing the Persian kings of Zoroaster, as the son or priest of Oromasdes. And yet Darius, in the inscription at Beaston, boasts of having restored the cultist of Ormazd and put down the Magian rites. Evidently, there were two distinct and antagonistic Magian schools. The oldest and the most esoteric of the two being that which, satisfied with its unsatiable knowledge and secret power, was content to apparently relinquish her exoteric popularity and concede her supremacy into the hands of the reforming Darius. The later Gnostics showed the same prudent policy by accommodating themselves in every country to the prevailing religious forms, while still secretly adhering to their own essential doctrines. There is also another hypothesis that is possible, which is that Zero Ishtar was the high priest of the Chaldean worship, or the Magian Hierophant, when the Aryans of Persia under Darius Hystaspes overthrew the Magian Gometes and restored the Mastian worship. There ensued an amalgamation of which the Magian Zoroaster became Zarathustra of the Venedad. This was not acceptable to the other Aryans who adopted the Vedic religion as distinguished from that of Avesta, but this is but still a hypothesis. And whatever Moses is now believed to have been, we will demonstrate that he was an initiate. The Mosaic religion was at best a sun and serpent worship, diluted perhaps with some slight monotheistic notions before the latter were forcibly crammed into the so-called, quote, inspired scriptures, end quote, by Ezra. At the time, he was alleged to have rewritten the Mosaic books. At all events, the Book of Numbers was a latter book, and there the sun and serpent worship is as plainly traceable as in any pagan stories. The tale of the fiery serpents is an allegory in more than just one sense. The, quote, serpents, end quote, were the Levites or the Ophites, who were Moses' bodyguards. See Exodus 32:26. And the command of the, quote, Lord, end quote, to Moses to hang the heads of the people, quote, before the Lord against the sun, end quote, which is the emblem of this Lord, the unequivocal. The Nazars or prophets, as well as the Nazarenes, were an anti-Bacchus caste, insofar that in common with all the initiated prophets, they held to the spirit of the symbolical religions and offered a strong opposition to the idolatrous and exoteric practices of the dead letter. Hence the frequent stoning of the prophets by the populace, and under the leadership of those priests who made a profitable living out of the popular superstitions. Ottfried Müller shows how much the Orphic mysteries differed from the popular rites of Bacchus, although the Orphichoi are known to have followed the worship of Bacchus. The system of the purest mortality and of a severe asceticism promulgated into the teachings of Orpheus, and so strictly adhered to by his votaries, and incompatible with the lavishness and gross immortality of the popular rites. The fable of Aristaeus pursuing Eurydice into the woods where a serpent occasions her death is a very plain allegory, which was in part explained at the earliest times. Aristaeus is brutal power pursuing Eurydice, the esoteric doctrine, into the woods where the serpent, emblem of the sun god and worshipped under its grosser aspect by the Jews, then kills her, i.e., forces truth to become still more esoteric and seek shelter in the underworld, which is not the hell of our theologians. Moreover, the fate of Orpheus, torn to pieces by the Bacchantes, is another allegory to show that the gross and popular rites are always more welcome than divine but simple truth, and proves the great difference that must have existed between the esoteric and the popular worship, as the poems of both Orpheus and Musaeus were said to have been lost since the earliest ages, so that neither Plato nor Aristotle recognized anything authentic in the poems extant except in their time. The poems extant in their time. It is difficult to say with precision what constituted their particular rites. Still we have the oral tradition and every inference to draw therefrom, and this tradition points to Orpheus as having brought this doctrine from India, as one whose religion was that of the oldest Magians, hence that to which belong the initiates of all countries, beginning with Moses, the quote, sons of prophets, end quote, and the ascetic Nazars, who must not be confounded with those against whom thundered Hosea and other prophets to the Essenes. This latter sect were known as Pythagoreans before they rather degenerated, then became perfected in their system by the Buddhist missionaries, whom Pliny tells us established themselves on the shores of the Dead Sea, ages before his time, quote, per secularium Malia, or Milia, end quote. But if, on the one hand, these Buddhist monks were the first to establish monastic communities and inculcate the strict observance of dogmatic conventional rule, but then on the other hand, they were also the first to enforce and popularize those stern virtues so exemplified by Sakyamuni, which were previously exercised only in isolated cases of well-known philosophers and their followers, virtues preached 2 or 3 centuries later by Jesus, practiced by a few Christian ascetics, and gradually abandoned and even entirely forgotten by the Christian Church altogether. The initiated Nazars had ever held to this rule, which had to be followed before them by the adepts of every age, and the disciples of John were but a dissenting branch from those Essenes. Therefore we cannot well confound them with all the Nazars spoken of in the Old Testament, and who were accused by Hosea of having separated or consecrated themselves to Bosheth, which implied the greatest possible abomination. To infer, as some critics and theologians do, that it means to separate oneself to chastity or continence is either to advisedly pervert the true meaning or to be totally ignorant of the Hebrew language. In the 11th verse of the chapter of Micah, it half explains the word in its veiled translation, quote, pass ye away, thou inhabitation of Saphir, etc., etc., end quote. And in the original text, the word is Bosheth, reader's note, moon god, Baal, Essene, end of reader's note. Certainly neither Baal or Ahoa Kadosh, with his Kadeshim, was a god of ascetic virtue, albeit the Septuagint terms them as well as the Gali, the perfected priests, or the quote initiated, end quote, and the quote consecrated, end quote. The great sod, reader's note, mystery, and reader's note, the great sod of Kadeshim, translated in Psalms 89 verse 7 by quote assembling of the saints, was anything but a mystery of the quote sanctified, end quote, in the sense given to the latter word by Webster. The Nazarene sect existed long before the laws of Moses, and originated among people most inimical to the quote chosen, end quote, ones of Israel, vis-a-vis the people of Galilee, the ancient Ola Podrida of idolatrous nations, where was built Nazara and the priest of Nazarene. It is in Nazara that the ancient Nazarea, or Nazarenes, held their quote mysteries of life, end quote, or their quote assemblies, end quote, as the word now stands in the translation, which were but the secret mysteries of initiation, utterly distinct in their practical form from the popular mysteries which were held at Bilbis in honor of Adonis, while the true initiates of the ostracized Galilee were worshiping the true God and enjoying transcendent visions, what were the, quote, chosen, end quote, ones doing? Ezekiel tells us in chapter 8, when in describing what he saw, he says that the form of a hand took him by a lock of his head and transported him from Chaldea unto Jerusalem. Quote, and there stood 70 men and the senators of the house of Israel. Quote, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients do in the dark? End quote, inquires the Lord. Quote, at the door of the house of the Lord, behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz, or Adonis. We really cannot suppose that the pagans have ever surpassed the, quote, chosen people in certain shameful abominations of which their own prophets accuse them so profusely. To admit this truth, one hardly needs even to be a Hebrew scholar, but let him just read the Bible in English and meditate over the language of the, quote, holy, end quote, prophets. Thus this accounts for the hatred of the later Nazarenes for the Orthodox Jews, followers of the Esoteric Mosaic law, who are very ever taunted by the sect with being the worshippers of Erubo Adonai, or the Lord Bacchus, passing under the disguise of Adonai Ikoa Iaho, the Lord Sabaoth, the Baal Adonis, or Bacchus, worshipped in the groves and public sods, or mysteries, under the polishing hand of Ezra, becomes finally the later voweled Adonai of the Nazara, the one and supreme God of the Christians. Reader's note, that comes from Isaiah 61:1, and it comes out of the Septuagint, not out of King James or one of those other Bibles. That's where you'll find it say Lord Sabaoth. End of reader's note. Quote, thou shalt not worship the Son who is named Adonai, end quote, says the Codex of the Nazarenes, quote, whose name is also Kadush and Il or El. The Adonai will elect himself a nation and congregate in crowds. His worship will be exoteric. Jerusalem will become the refuge and the city of the abortive, who shall perfect themselves, circumcise themselves with the sword, or the word, the law, and shall adore the Adonai. Jesu, or Yisu, is Nebu, the false Messiah. We'll continue on with part 3 in chapter 3 of section 2, Religion, from Isis Unveiled by H.P. Blavatsky. Until then, love yourselves and love each other unconditionally.